Two iron blades lie in the soil of an English field. They are the color of dried blood and old rust. The edges have gone soft with corrosion, but the shape is unmistakable. These are swords. And down the center of the nearer one, if you catch the light correctly, there is a faint twisting grain in the metal, like the pattern in a piece of oak. They were found in March 2023 in a field in Gloucestershire, near a village called Willersey. Not by an archaeologist, by a man with a metal detector at a weekend rally, walking a field that had been plowed and cropped for generations. His name is Glenn Manning, and more than 2 years later, the organization responsible for England's historic environment has published an account of what happened next, and it contains a sentence that should not be possible to write about two objects this well studied. They still do not know how the swords got there. Let me tell you what these are, because the type matters. They are called spathae. A spatha is a Roman cavalry sword, longer than the short stabbing gladius carried by an infantryman, because a man on a horse needs reach. If you have a picture in your head of a Roman soldier, you are probably picturing the wrong sword. The Willersey blades have been dated to the early 2nd century after Christ, running into the 3rd. Sit with that for a moment, because it quietly removes the first explanation that comes to mind. Rome invaded Britain in the year 43. By the early 2nd century, the conquest was old news. There were towns, there were roads, there was a wall being built across the north. These are not swords from an invasion. They were made and carried and lost during the long, settled middle of Roman Britain, generations after anybody was fighting for the place. Both swords went to a laboratory at Fort Cumberland and were X-rayed. The X-rays showed that the two are not equals. One blade is plain. The other carries that twisting pattern down its center, and it is not decoration in the way a painted line is decoration. It is structural. Rods of iron were forged, twisted, and welded together to make the blade, and the pattern is the seam of that process showing through. Historic England describes the pattern-welded sword as the higher status of the two. The X-rays also showed something on one of them that had survived being in wet English clay for 1800 years. Traces of a scabbard. So, two cavalry swords, one of them somebody's good sword, one of them still partly in its sheath, lying together in a field with no Roman fort, no Roman road, and no known Roman anything within sight of it. Now, none of that would have happened if the swords had gone into a drawer. Britain has a system for this, and it is unusual enough that it is worth explaining if you're watching from somewhere that does not have one. It is called the Portable Antiquities Scheme. When somebody digs up an old object in England or Wales, they can take it to a local officer whose job is to record it, what it is, and crucially, exactly where it came from. The object usually stays with the finder or the landowner. The information becomes public. The swords from Willersey were identified through that scheme, which means a man at a weekend rally handed 2 lumps of corroded iron to someone who recognized them and said where in the field he had picked them up. That second part is the part that mattered, at which point Historic England and a company called Cotswold Archaeology did the thing that turns a nice find into a story. They went and looked at the field, not with spades at first, with instruments dragged across the surface, reading what is under the plough soil by measuring how the ground responds. It is a slow, undramatic process, and it is the reason we now know that the field was not empty. The field was full. The excavation that followed was funded by Historic England and directed jointly with Cotswold Archaeology. The archaeologist on site was a project officer named Peter Busby. Buzz to the people who work with him. Historic England's senior archaeologist on the project is Ian Barnes. I am naming them because the videos you will find about discoveries like this one usually do not, and because these are the people whose account of the field this is. Start with the ring ditches. 3 of them, possibly 4, the largest around 18.5 meters across. A ring ditch is what is left of something round that stood above the ground and has since gone, the negative of a building or a monument, surviving as the trench that once held it or drained it. Then the enclosure, 68 meters by 55, a rectangle you could fit most of a football pitch inside, and around it, a ditch 5 meters wide. 5 meters. Stand at the edge of that, and the far side is further away than the width of a normal road, and it is deep enough that you cannot see the bottom from where you are standing. It was dug with antler, wood, iron, and hands by people who had decided that this particular piece of Gloucestershire needed a boundary you could see from a long way off. And it is not Roman. It is Iron Age. It was already old when the swords were made. Inside that enclosure, the excavation found a burial. Someone was laid in the ground here, and around the upper part of their right arm was a band of iron. Not a bracelet in the way we would mean a bracelet. A band of iron on the arm. We do not know whether it was an ornament, a mark of status, a mark of ownership, or something we have no category for. It was on the right arm, above the elbow, and it stayed there while everything else about that person went away. In a pit nearby, they found a horse skull. Not a horse, a skull. Buried on its own, in its own hole, in the ground, near a human grave. Horses are not casually buried in the Iron Age. Horses were wealth and speed and status, and where we find them treated deliberately, we are usually looking at something that meant a great deal to the people doing it. Whether the skull and the burial belong to the same moment, the same year, or the same century is not something the excavation has been able to establish. They are near each other. That is what we can say. And then there is the ditch, not the burial. The ditch, the great 5-meter boundary. In the material that had filled it up over the centuries, the excavation recovered arm bones and hand bones, not a body laid out, not a grave, parts of a human arm and a human hand in the fill of a boundary ditch. There are ordinary explanations for that. Bone moves. Plows cut through graves and scatter them. Ditches are where things end up. There are also less ordinary explanations, and the honest position is that a fragment of arm in a ditch will support almost any story you would like to tell about it, which is exactly why you should be careful with it. I have deliberately not told you the part you can see coming, because on top of all of this, the ring ditches, the enclosure, the burial with the iron band, the horse skull, the bones in the ditch, there is a Roman building, limestone walls, ceramic roof tiles, box flue tiles, which are the hollow tiles that carry hot air up through a wall, which means heating, painted wall plaster, which means somebody cared what the rooms looked like, copper alloy fittings from a scabbard and from straps, a copper alloy bowl in fragments. Historic England's description of the building is careful, and I am going to be careful with it too. It says the remains possibly represent a winged villa. Possibly. That is the word in the source, and I am not going to upgrade it for you. But something substantial and Roman and comfortable was built on ground that Iron Age people had enclosed with a ditch 5 meters wide. That is the reason this field matters, and it is a bigger argument than 2 swords. The oldest question about Roman Britain is not what Rome built. We can see what Rome built. The question is, what happened to the people who were already here? Did they go? Were they replaced? Or did the same families stay on the same ground and gradually start buying different pottery, building in a different style, heating their rooms, and answering to a different tax collector? You cannot settle that from one field. But a site where the periods run from the early and middle Iron Age through the Roman 1st and 2nd centuries with a Roman building sitting on an Iron Age enclosure, is a small piece of physical evidence in the argument. Not people arriving in an empty landscape, people continuing in an occupied one. Now the part that the clone versions of this story will leave out. Here is what this excavation does not show. It does not show that the building is a villa. Possibly, says the source, and possibly is not a fact. It does not show that the burial with the iron band and the buried horse skull belong together. They are near each other in space. Nothing published establishes that they are near each other in time. It does not tell us whether the arm and hand bones in that ditch are Iron Age or Roman, and until it does, anything built on them is a guess wearing a costume. And the final report has not been published. The site is being considered for formal protection as a scheduled monument, and that decision is waiting on the report being reviewed. Which means everything I have told you is an interim account. Solid, from the people who did the work, and interim. Which brings us back to two pieces of iron. Because after the geophysics, after the excavation, after the ring ditches and the enclosure, and the burial and the horse and the villa, that is possibly a villa, nobody has explained the swords. You can construct explanations. They could have been hidden and never collected. They could have been lost, though losing 2 cavalry swords takes a particular kind of day. They could have been placed in the ground deliberately, which is a thing people did with valuable metal for reasons that were obvious to them and are not obvious to us. They could have come from a grave that a plough found first. Historic England does not choose between those, and neither will I, because the evidence to choose does not exist yet. What we have is this: 2 Roman cavalry swords, one of them the better sword, one of them still holding traces of its scabbard, dated to a century when nobody in this part of Britain was at war, lying in a field in Gloucestershire that turns out to have been important to somebody for the better part of 1,000 years before they were made. The swords themselves have gone on public display at the Corinium Museum in Cirencester, 20-odd miles from the field, in the town the Romans called Corinium. You can go and stand in front of them. A man with a metal detector walked across that field on a Saturday. Everything else we know about it, we know because he reported what he found and said where.